Hello, you lovely lunatics. Welcome to the first video on my channel. As you'll 100% be able to tell throughout the entire video, I have no idea what the hell it is I'm doing. I've never made any sort of video before, but I thought I'd give it a shot. What I want to do is just touch on topics that I find interesting. If I read up on an article or whatever, find any topic that piques my interest, I'll share it with you. I'll read up on it and try to teach it to you, and hopefully we can stop being idiots together. So that's sort of the rationale behind this. And so, as a first topic, we're going to talk about the first planet that's been observed to orbit a white dwarf star. This is actually an article that I found that was published 2 days ago, 13th of October, on Nature. I read the abstract and I wanted to keep reading because it was super interesting. And guess what? Nature said, hey, pay us $9 to this. Screw you, Nature. But your boy's resourceful, and thanks to some outside sources, shout out to Leaky Luke, we got our hands on the article. So, fret not. I got you. I can drop the link to this article because I highly recommend you read all of it. I'm not going to go through it entirely. I'll drop that down below. You should definitely read it fully. So, what is this about? Like I said, this is about the first Jovian analog, meaning similar in size and structure to Jupiter in our solar system. So the first planet that's similar to Jupiter that was found orbiting a white dwarf star. This was done by J.W. Blackman et al., I believe from... Where from? The School of Natural Sciences from the University of Tasmania. They're doing God's work out here. Very interesting article. It's got some really cool graphics and pictures on the specific instrumentation and imaging that they did to find this star. I'll talk about it a little bit more, but if you really are interested and want to nerd out on this kind of stuff, I recommend you read this article entirely. They also go into some in-depth physics of the specific imaging. So yeah, if you are really interested in that, I'll try to put the link down below. But I will sort of explain it for a general audience, and because I'm a moron myself, I'll dumb it down because that's as much as I understand. It's not like I understand this physics. I'll explain as much as I can. So I thought a good place to start would be, I also recommend you read this. It's NASA's own page on everything you should kind of know about stars, because I don't know if everyone knows what a white dwarf star is. So I wanted to start there. So, what is a white dwarf star? So the life of a star generally goes like this. A star is formed because there is matter and dust in the universe. This is how practically all matter, such as planets, stars, comets, asteroids, are formed. But basically there's dust and matter in space, and through gravitational forces it starts to accrete. That means it starts to pull in on itself and amass together. When enough of this happens, the gravitational force actually causes enough mass to collapse under itself, and this forms what is known as a core. This is the beginning of a star. So as more and more matter accretes, the core of what will become the star heats up. And this is because there's nuclear fusion reactions happening, which is the bonding of hydrogen and turning it into helium. So when this happens, the core continues to heat up and it expands, basically combating the force of gravity, which wants to pull it in on itself into the core. And so it expands and stabilizes, which means it's no longer collapsing in on itself because it's constantly pushing outwards from the nuclear fusion. And this eventually stabilizes and forms a star. Now there's different types of stars that can be formed. I recommend you read this. And if you've taken any class on astronomy or read up on it, you're probably familiar with this, the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram. And it basically outlines the different types of stars generally that can be formed. This is a graph comparing the temperature to the luminosity, so how bright a star is. And these are basically your main types of stars. You have the main sequence stars, which are the most probable to be formed, and this is where our own sun is actually. So our sun's actually a pretty average star. Not too big, not too hot, and not too luminous, just right in the middle, the Goldilocks zone, really. There are bigger stars known as red giants and supergiants, which are actually the later stages of life of a normal star. Also, really hot and enormous blue giants. And then white dwarfs, which is what we're going to be talking about. So, basically, when all the nuclear fusion in the core of a star finishes, when there's no more sort of fuel, if you want to call it, if it's all used up, there's no more outward pressure to combat against gravity. And so the star starts to collapse in on itself. And what this does is continually heats up the core more and more. As the core keeps heating, it starts shedding its outer layers. And eventually you're left with a super dense, what was once the core, a super dense and hot core, which is now known as a white dwarf star. So you go from a regular sized, not too hot star like our sun, and it turns into this super compact, very small, basically around the size of the Earth, but with the mass of a full star. So it's incredibly dense. And that's what a white dwarf star is. And so these are very commonplace, hard to spot because they're not very luminous, as you can see, and so our instruments can't really pick them up because they're extremely far away, and so they don't emit enough light that we can really spot them. But what we've been able to do is actually use what's known as what's known as gravitational lensing. If I go here, this is actually what they used. So gravitational lensing is when there's enough mass in space, it starts to warp or bend or distort light that's coming from a source behind it. So say there's light and then enough mass somewhere, it starts to warp it, and our instruments can detect that warping and then assume that there's mass there. And so once we can assume that there's mass there, then we can hone in telescopes and special telemetry instruments to try to spot whatever it is that are there. And that's exactly what happened in this article. So we cannot spot the specific star because, like I said, it's too dim. But then spotting the warping, we were able to assume that there was probably a planet or multiple planets surrounding it. And then that's exactly what happened using the Keck 2 telescope. So it was spotted first on 2015. And actually, if you want to read up on the finding of this specific, when they basically first detected the warping and assumed that something was there, this happened. The earliest I could find was 2012. This is by the Astrophysical Journal. It's a huge collaboration by a bunch of universities and researchers. So I can drop this paper in as well. But getting back to what I was saying, so what have we found? A new white dwarf and Jupiter-sized system. So it's a huge, basically a really good analog to what our sun and Jupiter are going to be. This white dwarf star, which has already collapsed. So it was like an average star and turned into a white dwarf. And then a planet very similar in size and mass to Jupiter. This is actually 2 kiloparsecs away from our solar system, or about 6,500 light years towards the center of the Milky Way. So it's in the same galaxy as us. And like I said, this is the first detection of a planet orbiting a white dwarf using microlensing. So that's really interesting. Some light from background source bent by gravitational field of the mass in the foreground, and then this led to distortion, and then we could spot it. And just as a fun fact, gravitational lensing is actually a prediction that came about from Einstein's general theory of relativity. So you can drop that little tidbit next time you're at the water cooler in your office. So like I said, this is an analog to the end stages of our sun. So in roughly 5 billion years, our sun is going to collapse in on itself because no more nuclear fusion is going to be happening at its core. So it'll go from being an average main sequence star, it'll turn into a red giant, or not a supergiant, a red giant. It's going to consume the inner planets. So Mercury and Venus are probably going to be completely gone. I don't know about Earth and Mars, but probably. And this is why it was so hard to spot planets orbiting a white dwarf star. A big reason is because the inner planets just get consumed and destroyed in the process of the star expanding and then contracting into the white dwarf star, right? And so for a long time, it was predicted that there could be farther away planets or bigger planets such as Jupiter or Saturn in that sort of area that might survive. And this had never been observed until now. So this is why this is really interesting. The specific name of the planet, it's MOA 2010 BLG 477LB. Whoever came up with that, come on. You've already gone through the process of finding something no one's ever seen before. You might as well name it something interesting, right? But whatever. So it's about 1.4 times the mass of Jupiter, and it's orbiting a white dwarf star approximately 0.53 times the mass of the sun. Yeah, so what does this present? Why is this interesting? Other than it's the first time we've observed something like this sort of presents the possibility that other planets can survive upon the collapse of their star. And so if you want to get hypothetical and then sort of go into the far-fetched areas, you can sort of start thinking about potential habitability of outer planets even after the star's collapse. So this was something that maybe hadn't been considered before, especially if you're considering, and this is very sort of sci-fi, and you could actually probably write a really cool story about this. But instead of considering a closer planet to the sun before it collapses, you could think about a farther away planet that will survive after it collapses, and maybe even on a moon of maybe like Europa, one of Jupiter's moons. If it's got like subsurface water that gets heated by Jupiter's tidal forces, then you could get away with being farther away from the star. And if that planet's going to survive, like we found here because of this analog, potentially Jupiter will survive after the sun collapses, then that moon might be a perfect place to habit. So that would actually make for a really cool like sci-fi story or something, inhabiting a moon and then waiting. This is assuming obviously that mankind makes it 5 billion years into the future and that we figure out how to inhabit other worlds. But anyways, I think it would make for a really cool story. What people call a second genesis. It's kind of like a new term. If you consider the first genesis is letting life arise when a star hasn't collapsed yet, and then after it collapses into a less bright star, then maybe like a second genesis where life can restart or keep going after that. So like I said, these are super far-fetched ideas, but really interesting to consider. And yeah, there's actually a quote from the main author of this paper, J.W. Blackman. He said, "If humanity is somehow still around in 5 billion years, we would probably have a better chance of surviving the sun's red giant phase on a moon of Jupiter rather than on Earth." That's basically what I try to paraphrase, but not so eloquently as Dr. Blackman here. So yes, the main takeaways from this video is that this is the first time that an actual planet has been observed orbiting a white dwarf star. And so this had for a long time been theorized, but this is the first time it's been spotted. So hooray. Yeah, that's basically all I wanted to say. As you've probably been able to tell, I have no idea what the hell it is I'm doing. This feels super unnatural, just talking to nobody. It's not even talking to myself because you have to pretend that there's an audience. So hopefully people are watching this. But yeah, this is sort of my first attempt at this. If you are interested and you liked it, let me know. I can keep making more of these. I mean, they're fun to make. It keeps me, like I said, it's cool to keep learning and keep finding out about new topics. And so I feel like if you can learn something new every day, then you're set, right? You just keep increasing your knowledge base, and then you have interesting things to talk about at parties, if it is that you're going to parties. But I don't know, if you're looking into habitability of systems orbiting a white dwarf star, then maybe you aren't going to parties. But like I said, if you liked it, let me know. I can keep making more of these. And so until I see you again, enjoy. Bye.